Maybe I'm misreading history, but between the Declaration of Independence and William Penn's Quaker movement, I grew up in the Philadelphia area, the disparate reasons for emigration, it seems to me, were not a unifying principle of revealed democracy or democratic principle that led inexorably to our form of constitution. The necessity of amendments was probably baked in the cake. In fact, when the colonies collectively decided that it was time to break away from their homelands back on the European continent, because different groups and different colonies were breaking away for differing self-interests.
Oh, absolutely. The Puritans came over because they wanted to build a shining city on the hill. They wanted to purify their group. They were intolerant of others. The sin of one was the sin of all, and that was one model. The Quakers came to your area, Pennsylvania. My mom came from that area too, and they were very tolerant. The Quakers were tolerant of all other religions. So it was a very different model. The Catholics came to Maryland and tolerated others, but said that the Catholic Church should be supreme. The people who founded Virginia came for economic reasons. They had no religious reasons at all. So we had all of this diversity, luckily. The people who came to Georgia, for example, were ex-prisoners. And the only way to preserve the diversity was to allow freedom of religion. But the freedom of religion is a two-edged sword, because it's based in two clauses. It says that the government can't establish a religion, which basically means it can't support a religion. And on the other hand, the government has to allow the free exercise of religion. Well, if I give you free exercise of your religion, I may be supporting it. And that has been a dilemma for the Supreme Court to work out. That's been very difficult in our history.
Such things as holiday displays in December that we argue over all the time.
Putting the Ten Commandments up in the courthouse. And the Supreme Court has generally ruled that if those things have been there historically for a long period of time and other displays are allowed, it's okay. But if they've just been put up and they seem to support a religion, then they've been struck down.
But we're talking only about municipal or federal or government property.
Yes, that's right.
You bring up the point of the difference between the government and religious freedoms, and hands-on and hands-off. And we hear so much this expression, the separation of church and state. Where is the separation of church and state? I read the Constitution, I don't see it.
It's not in the Constitution. You make a very good point. The separation of church and state, a wall of separation, was the phrase that was used by Thomas Jefferson when he was president in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Church in Connecticut. And later Supreme Courts picked up this phrase and keep using it in decisions. So they've reified it and made it stronger and stronger, trying to make that wall stronger and stronger. But it's a difficult area to deal with. Obviously, most of the founders certainly believed in God. They were at least deists. Many were very religious. But they left God out of the Constitution and tried to create an environment in which we were all free to believe in the way we wanted to believe.
Nonetheless, the Declaration of Independence, as I recall, mentions God specifically in three different places. Isn't the Declaration of Independence kind of incorporated by reference into the Constitution or the fabric of the country, in the sense that it is the reason that we have a Constitution and the reason that we have a country for which we want to assemble a workable fabric?
You know, the Declaration of Independence is a very interesting story, because it obviously is written, you know, in 1776, when we're going to break with England, and then we have to put a government together. So the frame for the government is the Constitution. The dream, if you will, is the Declaration of Independence. The first inculcation of the rights, the inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution, is when the Bill of Rights is ratified, when they add the 1st through 10th Amendment to the Constitution. That brings some of the Declaration in. The second time that the Declaration of Independence becomes one of our holy documents, if you will, is when Lincoln references it in the Gettysburg Address and says that's what we're fighting for. It's not so much the Constitution, it's those inalienable rights. That's what this country was born for. And that gave a priority to the Declaration of Independence. And you'll see in some Supreme Court decisions, some justices refer to those inalienable rights without referring to the Constitution as the natural rights that we've inherited and that we have access to.
In fact, on all of our money, it says, "In God we trust." Is that one of those things that is, as you put it a few moments ago, is kind of grandfathered into the culture?
It is grandfathered in. And, you know, the other one that's been controversial lately is the "under God" phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance. And a man brought a suit all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was thrown out. They refused to rule on it. It was thrown out because he did not have legal custody over the child that had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So the Supreme Court has yet to rule on that one. It was inserted into the pledge in 1954. And it's a very controversial topic.
You've made reference a couple of times to different colonies and different disparate interests and self-interests for why they came into being and why it was they pushed for this and that in the Constitution. And I assume it's no coincidence that Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia pushed hardest for the Bill of Rights, and those happen to be the three geographic areas that still to this day refuse to call themselves states. They call themselves commonwealths.
Yeah.
What's behind all that?
Well, I think it's based on the Old English model, that was the kind of government that was put together, and a commonwealth was almost like a country. They also had, each of them in their constitutions, written in free speech and free press, which other states had not done. Those three had done that, and actually the Pennsylvania frame, which was their Declaration of Independence, and their Constitution, was the first to incorporate all of those rights in one document. So they were forerunners to the Constitution, and they wanted our Constitution to reflect their constitutions.
And if you study the original Constitution, of course, you would notice that three people who helped to actually draft the Constitution, once it was done, refused to sign their names to it, including a man named Elbridge Gerry,
yes,
a governor of Massachusetts, for whom we get the word gerrymandering now for carving out interesting political districts. They held out and they were not satisfied, kind of like what we've been watching in terms of health care debate in the United States Congress today. Yeah,
absolutely. They held out. Patrick Henry wanted a second convention called the minute the first one was concluded, and said, you haven't done it right, and we need to go at it again. But eventually it all worked out.
Language of the First Amendment, and I think this is remarkable if you step back and look at it. The language is held up for well over 200 years, and I think you said that James Madison's wordsmithery was really important in getting that done. And this brings up the question that is debated frequently on college campuses and elsewhere. What does the Constitution say and mean? Is it what the framers originally intended, or is it what the words actually say on the document itself? And how do we judge either one?
That's a very good question, because you have a number of Supreme Court justices. We have 9 Supreme Court justices, and they have very different philosophies in that regard. Clarence Thomas believes in looking at the intent of the founders and tracing that intent back into the Declaration of Independence. So he's a natural rights kind of justice. Justice Scalia does not believe in looking at original intent. He says it's too hard to assess what the founders meant. We need to look at the document itself and just read the words in context, and then we'll know what they mean. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg believes that the Constitution's a living document and needs to be reinterpreted in terms of contemporary contexts. So that's why you get split decisions on the Supreme Court. You can see that they're coming at this from very different directions.
And of course, whenever one of them comes up for confirmation before the United States Senate, when he or she is appointed, or nominated, I guess I should say, by the President of the United States, it seems that they are almost obligated to say, I'm a strict constructionist, I will judge the Constitution by exactly what it says. But we don't agree what it says.
That's right. That's right. And everybody wants to avoid legislating from the bench, where you make a ruling which actually put laws into effect. That happened with Earl Warren in the Earl Warren Court. They took the federal rules of procedure and applied them against the states. And people were outraged. That's what the Impeach Earl Warren signs were all about back in the late 50s and the early 60s, is imposing these federal rules on the states so that the states no longer could be the 50 laboratories that produce best practices. That was the model that the founders really had in mind. And so that's why you get those statements out of nominees. But they get on the court and they do what they want.
And when you talk about being accused of legislating from the bench, I know some really, really bright legal scholars and constitutional scholars who will say, wait a minute, that's part of what the bench is there for. They're supposed to legislate from the bench. That's why we put them on the bench.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think they're there to interpret the law, and they can interpret the law from their focus, whether it be a living constitution or whether it be a strict constructionist or whether it be original intent. All of those things are a possible way to interpret the law. But when you take a federal rule and apply it against the states, I think you're overstepping your bounds, and that becomes problematic.
You've made reference many times over the past few minutes to the notion that this is a living debate, that in fact nothing is completely settled, that we continually bring up these new opportunities for the Supreme Court to help us interpret and understand what the Constitution says and the amendments require of us in terms of freedoms. But in reading your book, it occurs to me that the very foundation of the two-party system in the United States is exactly based on this set of debates and this set of arguments. Is that true? Talk about that, if you will.
Well, I think it is. I think that you can trace the Federalists through to the Whig Party, through to the Republican Party, right into our own time. I think you can trace the Anti-Federalists into the Democratic Party under President Jackson, and then into our own time. These issues are issues that never quite get resolved as we work through how much power a state's going to have, how much power the federal government's going to have. And the parties continue to play with that. The Republican Party tends to be more conservative, tends to want to give the states more responsibility. The Democratic Party tends to be more patronizing, taking care of people, and that requires the federal government to have more power. And we've seen that in the health care debate. The Republicans are saying, I don't want the government running my health care program, and the Democrats are saying, I want the government to have a public option, which eventually was finessed out.
When we talk about public officials as well as Supreme Court justices, they all have to take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And I'm wondering, isn't that unconstitutional on its face? That's forced speech. For example, the Quakers refused to swear upon a Bible or the Constitution or anything else. They might be willing to say, I hereby affirm that I will abide by these strictures and restrictions, but they won't swear by anything. And yet we require our elected officials to take oaths of office.
Well, and if you have a religious objection to it, they will work that out. The courts have ruled that we have to respect your religion in that regard, and we have to respect your free speech in that regard. So you do not have to take an oath to hold the job. All you have to do is affirm, or whatever language you're comfortable with, that conveys the same meaning. So the courts have come down on the side of religion in that one, and religious freedom in terms of oath-taking. Recently there was a professor in the California State University system that was removed because she hadn't taken the proper oath at the proper time for one of the positions that she was up for, and eventually she was reinstated. The courts overruled the California State University on that one.
Before we run completely out of time, and we just have a minute or so left, what about hate speech, and what about what people refer to as fighting words?
Right. There was a decision in New Hampshire. A man named Chaplinsky said some nasty things to a sheriff. The sheriff punched the guy out. The court ruled that the words were fighting words and that he had thrown the first punch, and therefore his speech was not protected. His speech was an action. And when your speech becomes an action, such as treason, then it's not protected by the First Amendment.
Very good. And with all this talk of freedom of the press, we haven't yet even touched on journalists, for example, and who don't use presses, incidentally, these days. Many journalists don't. We'll have to discuss, for example, broadcasting on a future program, another half hour.
Sounds like a plan.
Would be absolutely delighted to talk with you about it. We've been talking with Dr. Craig R. Smith, who literally wrote the book, The Four Freedoms of the First Amendment. And thank you for joining us for the First Amendment and you.